This is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video or podcast on your favorite platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms. If you go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com, you can find links to the videos or MP3 files, which you can download and enjoy without commercial interruptions. If you're into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If scary stories are your bag, and listening to encounters with cryptids, ghosts, dogmen, and other weird creatures sends a shiver up your spine, then go to supernaturalstorytime.com for links to our weekly podcasts. Noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird can be found at eerie.news or visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at miamighostchronicles.com. Please subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just go to mppellicer.com for a link. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi, how's everybody doing? Good? I'm good. And briefly, I wanted to bring up, because I forget about this myself. You know that traditionally Christmas time around this was a season where ghost stories. Everybody thinks of. As a matter of fact, you see that trend. Around Halloween is when everybody digs up ghost stories, or you see the magazines and everybody run all these stories about haunted places. And traditionally, before, once upon a time, ghost stories were more of a wintertime Christmas kind of thing where, it's cold outside and people are huddled around. And, we're talking here, Victorian times, where people would gather around. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the, how could you call it? The formula that a lot of the writers had was they would sometimes it would set the setting, like that character was in a setting with a group of people, and they would tell the story. Sometimes the story had happened to them, or sometimes they retold a story of someone they knew, of course, and it was usually a ghost story, which, by the way, was great. But yeah, I want to remind everybody that really traditionally now is really the time that the ghost stories were told and retold. And the traditional, the white lady on the stairs, whatever, or or the white lady of the castle, or whatever. And then you had other ones of just, you know uh, let me tell you something. Some of my favorite ones are what they call the time of the Raj, which is when the Brits were in India. And of course, they had, the British citizens that lived there, and they had a lifestyle, of course. And they had, like, of course, Rudyard Kipling wrote a bunch of great stories in that setting. But there's a bunch of other stories. That's one of my favorite settings for the ghost stories of that time. And as a matter of fact, they had several women authors which would just write with their initials, and I'm drawing a blank right now, which wrote some fantastic stories, which were, what's the word I'm looking for? They were ghost stories, but they also had an exotic flavor to them because of the setting, you know, things of that nature. And invariably, a lot of these stories was that um, the how can I say it? The Englishman, woman, whatever, was they. In other words, they kind of tripped over um, sometimes the traditions or things that they shouldn't do, that all of a sudden they find out about the supernatural while they're living there in India. It's very interesting. If anybody ever has a chance to look up any of the ghost stories from the Raj from that time period, you should. One of my favorites is one that's called To Let, Tolet, which is the equivalent of to rent. If you ever find that story, it's very good. Okay, let's get on to the good part. The good part is who is our guest tonight at Stories of the Supernatural, and this is the first time that he's here. His name is Joshua Chairs, and he is the director founder of Phantom Detectives LLC. He's a paranormal investigator, writer, researcher, musician, and publicist. He got interested in the supernatural at an early age while watching Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack. His interest in the supernatural peaked in 2002 when he had the opportunity to investigate the General Wayne Inn in Marion Station, Pennsylvania. In 2014, Joshua co-founded the Summerwind Restoration Society, along with Wisconsin paranormal investigator Greg Nering. Their goal was to use the original blueprints of Summerwind Mansion to restore, rebuild, and relaunch Summerwind Mansion as a museum. With its haunted history, Summerwind is known to be one of the most haunted locations in Wisconsin. In August of 2020, he founded Phantom Detectives LLC to help people who are going through paranormal experiences. Using the Paranormal Research Society blueprint, Cheers is hoping to build a team of renowned paranormal investigators and is dedicated to helping people that are going through these experiences. He has investigated the Sanderson Museum, Selma Mansion, Mill of Van Selma, White Chimneys, the General Wayne Inn, Fort Mifflin, Pennhurst, Smyrna Museum in Smyrna Museum and DePaoli Battlefield, Gettysburg, Chad's Ford Historical Society, and many other locations. On May 21st, 2021, Joshua's Future LC Company purchased the rights to the late Art Bell's former affiliate director's news program, Dark Matter News. Mr. Cheers was also the former producer of Dr. J Radio Live and Amy on the Radio. Help me welcome him. How are you doing today, Joshua?
I'm wonderful. How about yourself today?
Good. Wow, you've been busy the last few years, huh?
Oh, absolutely. With everything that's been going on, over the last couple of years since I founded Phantom Detectives and the way that we're trying to
Mm-hmm.
revolutionize paranormal investigating in Pennsylvania, we've been getting more and more requests for investigations, caseloads, and everything from that you had just mentioned to acquiring dark matter news, to also having to deal with more and more events, setting up vendor tables at places. We've been nonstop busy, and we're running full steam into 2024 to start
Mm-hmm.
thinking about like the next phase that we're doing, which is going to be setting up a paranormal tours division. Is something that I feel very
Okay.
passionate about, is to find haunted locations in our area and have people come investigate with us. So that's something I'm planning on kind of slowly rolling out as we get closer to that date.
Right, like it's like a way of legend tripping that's a little bit safer. The reason
Yes.
why I say this is that sometimes people, I've heard of, people going legend tripping on their own sometimes to supposed locations, and they either end up trespassing, they find squatters, or they fall through the floor, something like that. So it's good to
Yes.
have a place that you could go to where it's safe. I hate to say it, it's safe. I've
Exactly.
And let me ask you, you said you looked at unsolved mysteries when you were a kid. Did you ever have any paranormal experience when you were younger?
I would say most of the time, I just started like in the early, much like any kid diving into the paranormal. Of course, I started watching In Search of by Leonard Nimoy and
Mhm,
Unsolved
sure.
Mysteries of Robert Stack. And what really piqued my interest was there was this episode, of course, called the General Wayne Inn, which is a place I would later investigate. This is called the Inn of the 17 Ghosts. It was founded by a major. It was called the Wayside Inn in 1704, and during the American
Okay.
Revolution, it actually served as like Hessian soldiers used to come in and out of the place because it
Okay.
was actually like for actually using Colonel Raw's encampment. So he would have
Mhm.
them go there, and what's pretty amazing is famous dignitaries that would pass through there included Ben Franklin, Marquis de Lafayette, later on years later Edgar Allan Poe, and
Really?
then
Wow.
in 1792 Major General Anthony Wayne, who was, actually founded actually the name was changed to him because he actually would come in the General Wayne Inn a lot. He actually ran the Pennsylvania Continental Army for General Washington during the American Revolution, so they renamed it
Mhm.
the General Wayne Inn. And then, of course, over the years, people have reported seeing Hessian soldiers in the basement. People have reported, seeing like different full body, partial body apparitions, and then of course, what people would say when they watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode with Robert Stack, that there
Right.
would be like the supposedly the patrons in the bar would be watching it. All of a sudden, the clock would be turning clockwise on the
Oh
TV and
my
then turning
god, you're kidding. Oh,
counterclockwise.
that
So
that's yeah, that definitely has to have a lot of history. God knows what happened. What's that saying
yeah,
of walls could speak?
yes, absolutely. And then as we got in the '90s, I started, much like any kid, picking up every book I could by Dr. Hans Holzer, who was
Yes,
America's
absolutely.
first. ghost hunter. He kind of pioneered it all,
Yes.
you know, for people like us. And then, of course, his legendary investigations with his transmedium Sybil Leak and Ethel Myers.
Sybil.
And then, of
Yes.
course, you know, his investigations, of course, inspired Ghostbusters, the movies, you know, and the series that
Yes.
we all know today. And then, of course, in the '90s, I would one time just flip in the AM dial and I started hearing this voice. I was absolutely amazed. And he said Dreamland with Art Bell, and I just started
Art
listening to
Bell,
Art.
my
Yeah.
favorite. I love Art Bell.
And you know, later on, years later, I would end up having to work with his staff members, which was a
Mhm.
pretty memorable experience, booking their guests and setting up all their, all their talking points and sound checking the people. So it's pretty funny how that ended up happening years later. And then, of
Isn't that
course, in 2002, I really didn't have any. And I think I had one UFO experience as a kid. A resource I've ever seen, like lights in the sky.
right?
But I don't think it really didn't happen for me until like when I was 18, when I was down in the basement of the General Wayne Inn. My early mentor in the field, her name was the late Michael Lane Bear. She passed away back
Mhm.
in the early 2000s. She had a Philadelphia team at the time. So I went down to the basement of the General Wayne Inn. And down there, I started really getting cold chills. And I took 3 consecutive photos, much like when you're. And back then, let me say, ghost hunting equipment wasn't like it was today, with all these different like REM pods and these,
No,
you
no, there
know,
wasn't. There wasn't.
that
Yeah, it
you might
was
you might have just had like an EMF meter, maybe a voice recorder, and maybe you had a digital
your
camera.
body. Believe it or not, our
Yeah,
bodies. Like you said,
right.
you felt that chill. Your body is the
Yeah,
instrument sometimes when you were
exactly.
back in those times.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I what's pretty amazing was I took one of the 3 consecutive photos. That was like the old saying: is take a digital camera, take 3 photos, and see what pops up on the second and the third
Mhm.
one. And on the third one of my 3 photos I took in this one spot where people reported seeing this Hessian soldier, I started picking up these really weird green and yellow streaks of light. I've never seen anything like it, and I took it back to different, film companies during that time because I was a senior in high school. It was like one of my
Okay.
first, dibs into the paranormal, and people went back and said, "Hey, we have no reason why we can't explain why this is here." So it matches the color patterns, match the witness seen people of a Hessian soldier. So, and supposedly this Hessian soldier's name was Wilhelm. He died sometime during when Washington, you've seen the famous painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware in like
Yes.
1776. So to me, like it matches the witnesses, people supposedly saying this Hessian soldier is still trapped there years later. And of course,
Mhm.
unfortunately, there was the Jewish synagogue bought it in 2004. So 2 years later, it was converted to like a Jewish synagogue by Shabbat of the Main Line. So they purchased
That's
it,
a
and then
weird. That's a weird change.
yeah. So from
Okay.
rabbis, some rabbis that purchased it, and then all of a sudden, and then,
Okay.
and then of course they report they don't see. Oh, we don't see any ghosts. Are they just
Uh,
saying that to like maybe kind of not play on it, or they did renovate the place? So you wonder if the activity actually increased, or they're just kind of brushing it under the rug so nobody knows.
right.
you
Yeah. It's
know.
like yeah. It's like all right. If we ignore it, it'll go away.
Exactly. And then, of course, 2004, I graduated. I went to college, got Westchester University. I started going there, graduated in '08. And then, of course, all these shows started popping out on TV. You started seeing like
Mhm.
Ghost Hunters, Jason and Grant, the plumbers from Rooter Rooter, who are
Right.
longtime
Yeah. They
friends
were
of
like
mine.
the first ones that did that
Yeah,
that formula of the
ex-
ghost hunting. Yeah.
Yep, Jason and Grant, and then, but then you started seeing it. Then 2007, Ryan Buell comes out with Paranormal State. I know.
Yes.
I actually got one of their former members working with me, Holly Falst. She's actually an expert on occult studies and
Mhm.
occult symbols and religious studies, spirituality. Holly, of course, worked with Ryan Buell, and she's working with us now. And then, of course, Ghost Adventures started coming out. I know Jeff Pellicer very well, longtime friend.
Mhm.
He's been the writer and researcher from Ghost
Yes.
Adventures since its inception. And then, so all these shows started coming out. I really started loving how they would do it. Like they would go to a haunted location, they would set up equipment in different parts of the location, and then they would review it and see what pops up to share with the client. And I always found that interesting because to me history is like a time capsule. We're always trying to understand why history is like what's happening at some of these locations. Did something
Right.
tragic happen on why spirits are still haunting there, or did something happen where they started doing some kind of super, are they just making stuff up just to attract attention to a place? So
Sure.
I always loved like the backstory, checking the property records and seeing
Yeah.
exactly.
Sometimes you'd be surprised what you find. It's not
Absolutely.
sometimes doesn't line up with. Yeah. It's like wow. Sometimes it's worse than what you think when you do the research on it.
Exactly, and that's a lot of times that's what we do with our audio interviews. We just start drawing out. The Rick interviews the client, and then the client gives the history, so we don't have to really even check the because most of the location owners have like usually have all the history right in front of them, so we have all that. So it wasn't until 2014, then 6 years later, I created the Summerwind Restoration Society, and I would love to tell you a little bit about Summerwind and its
Yes.
history. So
Yes.
Summerwind is this old ruined mansion on the shores of West Bay Lake, Wisconsin. It was
Right.
built in 1914 by a guy named John Frank. Mr. Frank, of course, was moving from Akron, Ohio, so he built this place called West Bay Lake Fishing Lodge. You could stay
Okay.
there for $4.99 a night on the shores of West Bay Lake. And then what's pretty cool about this place, it was in the upper UP of Wisconsin, like the upper third, the northern
Mhm.
third. And then what's amazing was during this time, then Mr. Frank sold the property to a guy named Robert Patterson Lamont. Mr. Lamont, of course, was actually he had the place reconverted, so they renamed it from West Bay Lake Fishing Lodge to Lilac Hills. And then after the mansion got converted, a lot of people he started saying, "Hey," and he actually employed Chicago architects Thomas Tamaj and Vernon Watson to reconvert this old mansion. So after he reconverted, the ghost stories really started increasing from Summerwind. In the 1920s, it's rumored that U.S. presidents Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge actually stayed at the place because they were friends of
Okay.
Mr. Lamont's. And of course, Mr. Lamont ended up years later being a U.S. Secretary of Commerce under President Herbert Hoover.
There you go.
What what a coincidence that is! And then
Uh-huh.
so the servants started going into telling Mr. Lamont, hey, that there's ghost stories and there's different places out there, and of course Mr. Lamont said, hey, there's no such thing as ghosts. And then until he had his own experience himself one night,
Right.
while and this was actually on season one, episode two of A Haunting, and then
Yes,
basically,
that Summer Wind name, it rings a bell, but it's as you're telling the story, but keep going. It's very interesting.
sure. So Mr. Lamont, of course, he was at dessert. Here's one of my favorite ghost stories from Summerlin. So he actually ended up, him and his wife were sitting eating dessert one night in the kitchen area. And what happened was pretty wild. There's actually, according to the story of Summerwind, this basement door flew open and revealing a ghostly form of a man. So Mr. Lamont fired two shots. He grabbed his black powder fister, pow, pow, fired two shots, and the bullet
Right.
holes missed the ghost. And the basement door completely flew closed, and he left the property never to return. And then it wasn't until
Like
uh,
that.
and so he ended up dying in 1948. So the property then went to in the episode of a haunting. Her name was Miss Murray, but her real name was Miss Kiefer. So Lillian Kiefer bought the place after Mr. Lamont died, and over the next 20 years, she would lease out the property to different people to, to rent, and then they would give it back to her. And then the
Mhm.
Henshaw family moved in. This is where the summer wind story really picks up. So the Henshaw family moved in the summer of 1969. They absolutely had to have the place. They wanted it to be able to have an ultimate project as a fixer upper. They saw
Right.
great potential in it. So when they first started moving in, Mr. and Miss Hinshaw, of course, Miss Hinshaw had three kids of her own, and then Mr. Hinshaw had three kids of his own. It was kind of like step by step, or step kids and
That was
step
almost supposed to have been a very calm household. No, I'm kidding.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then what was wild was Mr. Lawrence supposing with the ghost stories, the doors or the windows would fly open on themselves, so they had to pretty much they had to nail the windows shut, and then after
Okay.
the windows were nailed shut, they would employ contractors to like start thinking about renovating the place. And what was supposedly wild was during the contracting, the tools would disappear and then reappear, like especially like they would have like a heater. This was one of the first properties to have like steam heat and electricity back in the
Okay.
20s. So for this old place to have that, they would be start working on pumps and stuff, and they would just break down and then start again. And then, according to where things really got bad at Summerwind is when, of course, Arnold Henshaw, of course, one day he started was trying to go outside. There's a legend of a report of a ghost story of his car catching on fire. So once his car caught on fire,
That's
um,
pretty radical. It's like
yeah. So once the car caught on fire, supposedly things started taking a turn for worse. He actually, one of my favorite ghost stories was this was one that'll gore your hair from Summerwind. I know the family personally, and that lived there in the 70s. And suppose it's got when the funny thing is when you look outside the property, it looks like kind of like a little bit like Amityville with the one of the corners of the house.
uh-huh.
So
Right.
And what's wild was his 10-year-old daughter April, who I know, of course, Ginger passed away in 2013. Um, and so basically, she actually, April told me as a kid, she crawled in this crawl space that was in the back of this room. And supposedly, Mr. Hinshaw shined a flashlight in there. Of course, April had found this skeleton with black hair.
Holy
Um,
crap.
uh, so basically, when that happened, according to her, like everything, they started taking a turn for the worse.
But like a
Mr.
human skeleton.
Exactly, with black hair. So according to that, then like what happened was Mr. Hinshaw, his real name was Jim Hill. Of course, they changed the name Hinshaw, a stage
Uh-huh.
name to protect the identity of the people involved.
Yeah.
So Mr. Hinshaw actually started playing the organ to all hours of the night. It was like a Wurlitzer or some kind of organ was actually at Summerwind back in the 70s. And then he started playing the organ every hour. And the family was so terrified they had to report staying in one room. And then what happened was Ginger called her dad and said, "Hey, I got to get out of here. I'm too terrified to live in this place." So basically, of course, then she tried attempting suicide, from what I hear, according to reports. And then Mr. Hinshaw ended up having a mental breakdown, committed himself to a mental institution up
That's
in Canada. He was never
mhm.
seen again. And then, of course, here's where the ghost story starts escalating because Ginger's father, his name was Raymond von Bober. He was a popcorn vendor from Chicago. He started saying, "Hey, I want to make a go of this place." So he went back to Miss Kiefer and said, "Hey, can I buy it or can I lease it out?" And she said, "Yes." So they went ahead and eventually were planning on renting it to buy it. And then what happened was they had similar problems that the Henshaws have. They went ahead and had tools that would disappear. They would have like they would try painting rooms, and all of a sudden they would try priming it, and all of a sudden the colors would change. And then, of course, it was rumored that they would take measurements. They had the original blueprints with them, and
Right.
then, of course, the blueprints would change shape. So when Summerwind was known to change shape, all that was going on. And then, of course, Raymond von Bober Jr., who I actually know, he's actually still alive. His dad died in 2005, right after the Haunting episode aired on Discovery Plus. Um, so he went ahead and actually, suppose he was going up into one of the rooms and upstairs, and then he started going. Then he felt, and he saw, like, and then he heard a noise downstairs in the basement area, and then when he started touching the he saw the bullet holes. He touched the bullet holes. He started seeing a vision of Mr. Lamont. You know how when you touch something, a psychometry, like with a medium, when they touch
Yes.
an object, they see past like visions of what happened during
Uh-huh.
that time. And so when he touched the bullet holes, he started seeing visions of the of Mr. Lamont firing his gun and then never returning to the mansion. So what was wild was the Von Bobers never stayed inside the house. They always had a trailer outside the house.
That's
So
very telling.
they never lived inside the house. And then of course Mr. Von Bober they um, basically decided after years they decided to abandon Summerwind around somewhere around the late 70s. And of course, von Bober Sr. Wrote a book called The Carver Effect, a paranormal experience. Supposedly, they were alleging in the book. Book is very hard to find, but if you can get a copy of it, it's really good.
What's the title on it?
The Carver Effect, a
The
paranormal
Carver effect.
experience. Yep.
Okay.
And according to the what they claim is supposedly this 18th century English explorer by the name of Jonathan Carver, who
Mhm.
supposedly was trying to get a northern third of Wisconsin, was looking for this land grant inside Summerwind. Now it's never been found, never been seen. But so what was happened was this Kiefer, she died around 85, 86. So what happened was my friend Craig Nearing knows the current owner's property. They bought the place around 86 because their names are Harold and Babs Tracy. So Harold and Babs Tracy bought it in 1986 for a couple from La Crosse, Wisconsin. So they went ahead and say, "Hey, maybe we can make a go of the place again." So when they purchased it, Mr. Tracy bought the property as a wedding anniversary present to Miss Tracy. So she went ahead, they went ahead, made an offer, bought it, and then unfortunately, they actually reported one of my other favorite ghost stories from their ownership of Summerwind was supposedly they would walk up to the place one night around 86, 87 after they bought it. And according to what they had told my friend Craig, who runs the Fox Valley Ghost Hunters up there, um, that supposedly the mansion was actually almost like breathing, like inhaling, like taking a life of its own. So
Oh.
what happened was, unfortunately, a year later on Father's Day of 1988. So now we're going to go into what happened. So what happened in Father's Day of 1988 was the place lightning and fire struck down Summerwind and basically burnt all the buildings on the property down. So all that remains today are the two tall chimneys, the foundation, and the steps. The place completely was razed and burnt. And what's wild was about 2017, a guy who basically his name was Jim Lechner, and former neighbor who lived next door at Summerwin in the early late 80s, early 90s, had supposedly told my friend Craig that supposedly the township was responsible for burning the property because they were tired of people trespassing on the
I've
property.
heard
Because
of stuff like that, believe it or not, in other haunted sites. I've heard of that.
yeah, like where people would try to legend trip and try to get a paranormal experience, and of course people are partying up in Wisconsin, so they would,
And they're like, "Man, we're tired of this."
yeah. So they decided to take it upon themselves. And was wild was supposedly a fire marshal, I can't remember his name now, supposedly had told Jim Lecter, hey, we're going to be on site. Don't worry, there's going to be there. Supposedly they took like bales of hay and they just pretty much, and you can look this up in the Milwaukee Sentinel, 2000, November
Okay,
2017. Supposedly they just raised the place and just leveled, got all the bales of hay and just leveled it. And, basically that's what burned it down. So this is where I enter the picture. So 2014 rolls around. I watched a haunting episode, and all of a sudden, I went to summerwinmansion.com, which was still, online at that time, and it said blueprints for sale. So I went ahead and, looked up this blueprints, and I emailed the seller. They turned out to be Raymond von Bober Jr., who is
okay,
Ginger's brother. And was wild was after doing that, I purchased the original blueprints and the original engineering directors I still have to this day. And after purchasing, I seeked out a connection to the property, and I came across Craig Naring from the Fox Valley
okay,
Ghost Hunters. They do paranormal tours up at the property. Said, "Hey, I know the owners. Call me." And then one day we started talking, and what we ended up doing was creating the Summer Wind Restoration Society in 2014 to rebuild. Because we said, "Hey, why don't we start thinking of rebuilding the place? This could be great
okay,
potential for somebody." So I went ahead, either one of the copy of the blueprints, and we started working on all the publicity for it. And now we're at a point where even though the place no longer physically exists, there's still a lot of things going on the property today. According to Craig, there's like they would investigate down there, and the rocks would come, would come up flying out of the foundation. They reported like in 2017 for something called World's Largest Ghost Hunt, which is a huge live stream event
okay.
from paranormal teams all the world. Something called a floating lady in the stairs area of the mansion. So pretty wild that is still
Let me
active
ask
to
you
this.
something, just out of curiosity, because I know that a lot of that area, because a lot of stuff went on during Prohibition, especially
Yes.
on
Yep.
houses that were like
Oh yeah.
stuff that you never, deaths that, things that weren't never made it to papers, and a
Yeah.
lot
Yeah.
of, and if they were around in the 1920s, especially on that lake, there's
Yes.
a very good chance something was going on there as far as bootlegging.
Oh yeah, definitely. And not to mention, according to the rumor of two U.S. presidents staying there sometime in the
Yes.
1920s, and then
Yeah.
the service telling them the house was haunted. There was a floating lady in the kitchen area. That's definitely something's going on there. Even
Yeah.
even and even now, 100 years later. So it seems to me that place is still very active to this day. So that's pretty wild. So that place was amazing. And then what I did was 2019. I started, I was in another team at that time, but I wasn't happy how it was progressing. So I went ahead and said, hey, I'm going to start my own team. So August 2020 rolls around, and I wanted to, because I really started doing some of my own investigation. I wanted to start my own team. So
Okay.
I created business cards, I created social media pages, I had a website built from the ground up, and I brought my former team member over from my old team. She has since left the team because she started her career about 2 years ago. But in the early days, she was great to really help get started. And then what I started doing was started like recruiting people to really fit what I'm looking for with my vision of building this team. So
Okay.
I think I was watching one of my, I saw this old 1950s comic called The Phantom Detective, which is an old comic back in the. And I said, you know what, this is a really cool name for a paranormal team. No
Yes.
one's ever
Yes.
used the name Phantom Detective. So I said, hey, why don't we go ahead and use that name? And then
Sure.
just started doing investigations under the old banner. So which is really cool is before we did our first investigation, we had the opportunity to train with Brian J. Cano. And of course, Brian J.
Yes.
Cano was on the show The Haunted Collector with John
Yes.
Zaffis.
Yes.
He was like the tech manager on that show. So he was in Selma Mansion in October 2020. So he showed us just the basic stuff. Like I already had a general understanding how to do some of it, like how to do EMF meters, how to use dowsing rods, how to use the SLS camera, how to use voice recorders, and just like how to use the equipment and your senses to conduct investigations. And then I took all that knowledge I learned from Brian, and then in December 2020, we did our first investigation at the Sanderson Museum in Chadsford, Pennsylvania. And then, of course, I had a website built from the ground up, which was awesome. We had a team from India build it, and they did a fabulous job
Okay.
completely just fixing it up. And then after we did it, we went ahead and started doing investigations. So the Sanderson Museum is a really neat place in history in Chadds Ford because it was this old museum that dates back to the 1960s, and a lot of historical. Mr. Sanderson was a musician. He was a poet. He used to host square dances in Chadds Ford. And if you go inside the museum, you'll see an actual bandage that was from President Abraham Lincoln that is still on display
Oh,
inside there, and a purse from the Jetty and Wade house. Of course, Jetty and Wade was killed in Gettysburg in 1863.
yes,
So,
yes.
so the first time
And
we
she was
did the
the only
investigation.
civilian casualty over there in Gettysburg. Yeah.
Yep. And what was wild was that supposedly that we did our first investigation. There's in the violin room with the Sanderson Museum. There is like you can of course Mr. Sanderson's personal violin collection is still there inside the museum. So basically, we went ahead and set up equipment in that area. And our former team member. We had a DVR, one of those NVR security camera home security systems that we use, and then
Okay.
of course our battery started being drained off the EMF meters.
There
And
you go.
then what was wild, not only did the battery start draining off our EMF meters, but also we also had the security camera was going off like crazy, like something was there, and we weren't in the room, mind you. And then of course I asked my team, I said, hey, quickly grab your camera, take some pictures, and you can see this really huge colored orb, and it didn't look anything like I said take the picture, and she took a picture right in that room. And on the third picture of the set that she took, you could see this really huge colored two colored orbs like back to back. I have no reasonable
You know
explanation why
what? In
that's
a museums that get so many items that
right.
sometimes you really don't know what comes with them.
Exactly. And that's what's wild is sometimes with these museums is that they end up having all kinds of history. And I absolutely love museums because history to me, like it's like it speaks. It's all about like the history and with these locations because there's so much going on at these old locations too. So one of my favorite is when we rolled into our second case, and this is like when I actually asked Mark Anthony. He's actually called the
Psychic
Mark
lawyer?
Anthony. Psychic Lawyer. You ever hear of him?
Of course, I've interviewed him.
Awesome, very cool.
Yes.
And he
Yes.
is one of my favorite people. Mark is actually, really cool. He's actually the author of three books. He's a fourth
Mhm.
generation medium. Arthur Finney College, Physical Science in England. He also, has actually written, also appeared regularly on Gaia TV and Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie. He joined our team. He kind of working with us remotely, but he's going to be joining us for investigation. So he joined the team, and then we booked a place called the Mill of Anselma in Chester Springs, Pennsylvania. So the Bill Van Summer, we did our second investigation. Our former teamer, of course, she was a volunteer there, so she was able to help us book that. And what was wild was you can see one of the best pieces, best pieces of evidence that we've ever captured in an investigation. So mind you, the Mill of Van Selma dates back to 1747. It's the continuous oldest operating mill in the United
Okay.
States. And what's
Wow.
really neat about this old place is it's called the Lightfoot Mill, created by a guy named Charles Lightfoot in 1747. And according to the reports, actually today, the mill is still operating today in since the 1700s nonstop. It's still going on today. And what's amazing is there was, of course, it's supposed to be doing like cornmeal, wheat, flour. I mean, all these different things are grinded up in this old mill. And
Uh-huh.
what's pretty amazing was there was a famous poet that actually once lived there, and her name was Sarah Oberheiser. Sometime in the early 1900s, late 1800s, lived there. And then, of course, she had ownership of a while. Then, of course, they went to another, after she died, they went to a guy named Mr. Collins, who was like the miller there up until the 1980s before he passed away. So
Right.
we did an investigation there one night back in January of 2021. So, mind you, there was no one on the property that night, so it was just us, me and my former team member. So we went ahead and set up a camera on this door. We had one of our home security system cameras that we set up on this door. And mind you, me and my former team member were the only one on the property that night. So we went ahead and put the
Okay.
camera on the door, and there was no wind, there was no rain, it was not snowing. It was just all us on the property. This door flew open by itself, and mind you, it has a timing latch. It's one of those old fashioned. You have to physically lift it up like this, and that thing was
Uh-huh.
bolted. That thing was bolted shut, and it just flew open. I have no reasonable explanation of why it happened, but it's one of the best pieces of evidence that we've ever captured. And then hours later, we were doing investigating the third floor. This rope actually, you can see it on one of the stock videos that we have, which I can always send your listeners. It started moving by itself like this, just kind of swinging back and forth. And mind you, that we were not on the floor at that time. And then, of course, during EVP session, we like to call it phantom time, where we let the phantoms come talk to us on our
Mhm.
voice recorders, and we actually
Right.
asked a question. You can hear the word "go, go" on the voice recorder, and mind you, it wasn't my former team member, and it wasn't me. So for that EVP to pop up was pretty wild. So that
Okay.
was pretty amazing. And then, of course, we started picking up several thermal imaging images. The thermal camera is a really cool piece of equipment because what it does is it utilizes hot and cold signatures, like auto mechanics use it to like figure out like where on a particular auto part if there's something wrong or a problem with maybe some kind of maybe try to figure out where something's maybe a piece of an engine's hot or overheating, or if it's cold. You can look for auto mechanics use them. Of course, people they also helicopters also use them thermal imaging. For looking for missing people in the wilderness. For example, someone's like a park ranger goes missing in some
Mhm.
wilderness. They can locate the heat source inside the woods and fly their chopper over. You can see like the cold spots, which are blue, and of course the orange or red. So we actually started getting thermal images from the middle of Anselmo. So pretty amazing. And
What do
this
you
is
mean?
where
Let me ask you something. Was a thermal signature colder or
yes. So
body
we were right
colder,
by
right?
the yep. So we were right by the Mr. Collins's, like his office is still there at the old Millivan Summit to today. No one of course uses it, but which is wild. Right by where his old office would be, actually picked up you can start seeing a silhouette of a apparition right near his old office. And what's
Okay.
amazing was REM pods started going beep 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 like that. They were going off, and we weren't even anywhere near that area. So this that was pretty wild. Our second case, we got double the activity that we did in the first case. And then what was wild was several months later, we actually went and I decided we needed to add more members to the team. So what I did is I went into the UFO world because I love UFOs myself and my passion of flying objects. So I went ahead and invited someone named Mr. Rick Warner. Rick actually comes from the UFO world. He was certified by MUFON. And what's
Mhm.
wild was when I first reached out to him, I actually thought he'd be a great fit because he's actually had skills in like interviewing people and witnesses. He brings some serious academia to our team. So when I brought Rick in, he actually has a lot of skills of like field surveying, and he knows all the nuts and bolts of from the UFO world. So he brought his skills in from MUFON to our talent pool, which added like he's a former certified UFO field investigator, and he's also the U.S. ambassador to the Italian UFO Federation, FUI. So he came in and really helped us. He started filming our investigations. He
Okay.
was able. He was actually able to start interviewing our clients. So he made his debut investigation at the Betsy Ross house. And the Betsy
Okay.
Ross house is an amazing historical place in Philadelphia. As
Okay.
you know, it's Philadelphia was like the cultural center of the world.
Yes, of
It was the
course. Yeah.
intellectual capital of the world back in the 1700s, early 1800s. So the Betsy Ross
Mhm.
house, and of course, in 1776, Betsy, of course, actually sewn our first flag in America. The first
Yes.
flag in American history was actually sewed at the Betsy Ross house. So, and there's a lot of ghost stories that people see in Betsy, different parts of the house. And mind you, we booked an investigation there in April 2021 with Historic Philadelphia, Heather Kincaid, who actually we reached out to her and we booked it. So we went and did investigation there. So mind you, we only had like 3 hours, so we had to really kind of do as much as
Wow,
we
that
could.
is, yeah, 3 hours is nothing for paranormal
Ex-
investigations.
Exactly. So we
Pretty
had to kind
short
of
time.
rush. But what was amazing was in the basement area. So Rick and our former team member at that time, who has since left, she actually, so I asked them, hey, could you guys start doing like EVPs down in the basement area, see what you capture and see. And what was wild was Rick's voice recorder. He started picking up these growls, like you can hear them on our website,
Oh, there we go.
phantomdetectives.org.
Where was it? In the basement?
Yep, the basement of the
Never
Betsy Ross
fails,
house.
man. Let me
Yeah,
tell you, and the reason why I'm saying this, I've been doing paranormal investigations since the 90s. And I tell everybody,
right.
I did it when you had to pay to develop film. That's
Yes.
way, back. And I don't know why, whenever you get some type of anomaly in the cellar, in the basement, like in the earth, it's usually
Right.
weird, like that growly stuff. So that's why I said the basement's like never fails. But anyway, keep going.
Sure. So, and it was wild was I was up in another room doing like up in there's actually two rooms, of course. Betsy's room's up on the third floor of the Betsy Ross house, and I was up there by myself. And I asked a question like, "Hey, is there anybody here with me?" And I got a response back on the voice recorder after doing playback and bring up on Audacity. It said, "I've
Uh-huh.
been here too." So for that to happen and those growls, and when I showed the evidence of
That
the historic
growls is
Philadelphia,
like, oh man, let me
yeah,
tell you
and
something.
of
I hear
course.
growls. That's like, that's not Betsy. How's that?
Exactly. And what's wild was I was actually in Betsy's room, so I went ahead and took the thermal imaging camera, just point and click, one of those FLIR thermal imaging cameras. They work absolutely great because you can get them in and out of places. Because mind you, there's a big barrier, like big plexiglass. So I had to, pretty much press the thermal camera against the plexiglass. But in the image that I was able to capture, mind you, there was no reflective surfaces on this plexiglass. I actually captured what appeared to be Betsy's spirit. You could see it right next to her bed, and mind you, there was nobody else there. There was nobody could have been my reflection because it wasn't my shape, and there was nobody else with me during that time. This was like in the early evening one night around like
Okay.
6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. So for that to happen, I have no reasonable explanation of why it happened. And then of course, Rick,
Let me
then I
ask you,
went to get.
have they been able to keep any of the original furnishings from back
Oh
then
yeah,
or no?
I think
Yeah?
a lot of I think like for example they have like I think they have one of the original replica flags. It's not exactly the original flag. I think the original flag I think is like
Okay.
still like around, but I think it's like in some museum. It has to be stored in some kind of
Sure.
like
Yeah, I was gonna
you know
say
so,
probably so it won't deteriorate. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Just much like the Declaration of Independence that was, of course, signed in basically 1776 at Independence Hall. I think
Right.
that that's still around, but you can see it was actually back then, of course, they used like sheepskin, which is like vellum, to do a lot of their early signings. But unfortunately, today the original Declaration has been pressed so many times over the years, from plates.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so unfortunately, so I went to go back and show the evidence that we captured to historic Philadelphia, and of course they downplay it like, oh well, no one's ever heard that down there. But of course, people that had visited the basement would otherwise say that yes, there is definitely paranormal activity going on. And my assumption is I checked the history of the Betsy Ross house and went back
Uh-huh.
into different property records. And what I think happened was for those growls to happen, somebody visiting the house might have like did some kind of religious ritual in the basement area, maybe
Absolutely. Yeah.
like
Yes. Yes. Yes.
so
Yeah.
for
They're gonna
those for
let me ask you something through the years, because I know a lot of times these historical homes, did it change hands, or did they from the beginning did they try to maintain it as the
yeah,
Betsy Roth house, or what happened?
yeah. I think what happened was like sometime in maybe the 1800s and 1900s. There, of course, there was a speakeasy for a while too after Betsy
There you
died.
go. My
I
God. There you go. Jeez,
so so
speakeasy.
so there so there might have been like some kind of since there was a tavern there at some point in the 1800s. Someone
Yeah.
might have did like brought a Ouija board or something, conjured something up from somewhere,
For
and
all
then
you
of
know,
course
there's a body buried down there. Things like that
exactly.
happen. Yeah, you never
And
know. It's like that.
and pretty wild is I think Betsy's either second or third husband. She's actually still buried on the property. Like you can see
Really?
her grave is right outside the house. It's actually like pretty much like pretty much like right there. Right before you walk in. There's like a right underneath a tree. You can see her grave is still there with her husband. So mind you. Like it's one of the most haunted places in Philadelphia. Of course, in the General Wayne Inn. Then, of course, what's wild is not only does Philadelphia have those two buildings, but there's also Eastern State Penitentiary. There's Fort Mifflin. I
I mean,
mean,
yeah, I've
Phil,
been, yeah, Eastern State Penitentiary's right there. Yeah, in
yep. So it's
Philadelphia.
all like centralized in that one area.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that I love is, of course, in May of 2021, I got a call from Leo Ashcraft, who, of course, I'm very familiar with him. Back in 2015, he worked for the late Art Bell, and he said, "Hey, I created this news service for Art Bell in May 2021. I no longer want it. I'm just trying to move off of it. Would you guys be interested in purchasing the news program that I had? I created a news service for Art." On a show called Midnight in the Desert when he came back for the final time in
I remember, of course,
2015,
absolutely, yes,
and and
yes.
and and, and included the website, the logos for Dark Matter News,
Hmm.
everything else that dealt with the names. So what we did was we purchased the rights to Dark Matter News, and then when instead of just burying it and letting it die, I decided why don't we instead of like just I decided we decided we'll just merge it into Fan Detectives because we already have our own growing team. We went ahead and just merged it into Fan Detectives. So we actually just kind of it just became like a division once the merger was complete. So we decided
Yes.
we're going to go ahead and we tore down the old website. I kind of completely bulldozed it and just rebuilt it to a beautiful new website. You can still see now darkmatternews.com. So I keep the website like as alive for like paranormal news stories. If you have like
It's really funny because if you hear these old recordings of Art Bell back in the 90s, he was sending out his stuff, a newsletter. This is, of
yeah,
course, prior to the internet coming in, and
yeah.
people would pay basically to get that information in the newsletter.
And
And
you know
then,
what's
of
funny?
course, it morphed.
Here's something funny. Two of his boys live right near me, and they're personal friends of mine.
Really?
One's actually named Vincent Pontius. Vincent, of course, is Art's oldest son. He lives in Philadelphia, and then of course his brother, Vincent's brother, Kevin Yanaga. He's a famous sushi chef in Philadelphia. So two of his
Okay.
boys live like pretty much an hour from me. What a coincidence that is!
Wow.
And
You know
of
what? You
course,
always think of Art Bell and Pahrump. It's like,
yes.
God,
And what's wild was his successor. Well, his on when he came back for the final time, he actually his protege was Heather Wade. Heather, of course,
yes.
unfortunately, is no longer available. She lost her mind. But
Let
I
me
was
ask you,
like,
wait, stop, stop. I'm going to stop. I'm going to ask you that. I
yeah,
was following because I've always been a fan of Art Bell. And then
right,
I remember Heather and, well, George Norrie took, the coast to coast, whatever,
yeah,
uh, and then, I followed some of Heather's stuff and all of a sudden it just went whoop and just disappeared. And I was like,
yeah,
what happened?
yeah. Like she has,
I heard something
unfortunately,
that she
after
couldn't get over Art's death is what I understood it to be.
yeah. And I was like best friends with her psychic advisor, Lasha. Lasha and Heather have her name's Lasha Senya. She lived in Vancouver, Canada. Lasha
Hmm.
and Heather were like they were like best friends. They did everything, talked together. Of course, Lasha worked with me on another radio show, but Lasha had told me Heather unfortunately had a mental breakdown after Art died. She would, supposedly be like on like she would go on networks, and then of course, networks would be ready for her to come on and start her stream. Then she wouldn't be on until like an hour later, and then she would be like just completely just losing. I think a lot of after Art's death kind of completely just devastated her, so she just had
Right,
a mental
but what
break.
I heard was that it was even like a year. It was like, yeah, it wasn't like fresh. It was like even after time had passed,
Yeah,
she was still acting like it had just happened the day before, is what I
yeah,
heard.
exactly. Yeah, and it's a shame because she's very
Yeah.
talented and all that, but she just has a lot of issues. So I pray someday she actually finds peace with herself and gets her mental health in order. And for now, I wish her well. And I just pray for every day
So
and
let
hope
me
that
ask
she
you
gets
something. Do you have Midnight in the Desert, or is just the Dark Matters news?
just the dark matter news portion. So what happened was in 2020. So Keith Rowland, of
Hmm.
course, actually Keith Rowland was Art's longtime business partner, longtime owner. So Keith actually went ahead and sold the network to actually my friend Tim Osmond. Tim Osmond, of course, hosts Infinite Plane Radio, who is a big Art Bell fan, and his partner, well, Tim Osmond sold a guy named Mike Marshallek. So they're supposed to be when the sale of Dark Matter Digital Network went through in April 2020. Keith retired. So after Art died, of course, he had different hosts that hosted it. After so
Yeah.
after he let go of Heather, of course, he brought in Dave Schrader. Of course, Dave did a
Yes.
fabulous job. He really did
Hmm.
a great. I'm a longtime friend of Dave's, and so basically, April 2020, a guy named David Rabini, who was one of Art's producers, was trying to finance. He's going to make payments to this guy from Hoboken, New Jersey. So the guy, he's of course a flat Earth guy. His name's Mike Marshallek. Mike Marshallek actually bought the network for some undisclosed price from Keith, and of course, what was supposed to happen was for the Dark Matter Digital Network was Rubini. This guy David Rubini was supposed to pay back this loan that he had from Mike Marshall. Like I don't know the exact numbers, but
Okay.
supposedly there was he was supposed to make payments every month, and of course Marshall like bought the company from Keith in sometime in 2020. And then what happened was, then Rubini got, had a, him and Marshall like had a falling out. And then Marshall like seized the company. And of course, there was a court case, if you read about it, in May of 21, that
Okay.
supposedly, there was some in a New Jersey courtroom about Art's final recordings. So there's that's still pending litigation. So I have no idea, but somehow there was a court case involved between like Marshallek and Rubini that was still going on. So Marshall like owns the company. So I was trying to eventually talk about acquiring Dark Matter Digital Network, but
Mhm.
unfortunately, I've not heard from him. So I was trying to work on getting like a deal done at some point in the future because I think it would be great if if the company was to eventually come back someday. But the problem was you would have to get the current owner to like either sell it or he would have
Right.
to be involved in running it. And of course Tim Osmond did a pretty good job. He actually did as long as he could, but of course Marshall like didn't want to pay him anything. So Tim's like, I can't do this anymore. So
Yeah.
he just decided to walk off Dark Matter back in late 2021. But I give him credit; he did his best, and hey, he did a commendable job for keeping the company going. So I'm glad at least I got a portion of the news service and network,
Yeah,
which
let
is
me tell you
very.
something, but yeah, when things get tied up in court proceedings, it's like, "Oh boy."
Oh yeah,
It's like
definitely. And I think what happened when Keith retired, that's when kind of everything kind of headed south because Keith retired
mhm.
and just went.
Yeah. Yeah, I hate
Yeah,
to say it, but yeah, sometimes there's always somebody behind the scenes who's the one that keeps everything, going, you
exactly.
know?
Like the glue that holds it together. And
Right, and then when that one person, you pluck them out of the process, that's it, like you said, it goes south and, good luck.
exactly,
Ah,
absolutely,
that's a shame. That's a shame
it
because let
really
me tell you something, even after what? Art Bell died in 2018, what is it, going on 5 years?
6 years now.
It's 6 years. I mean, it's like even now he's still a famous guy as far as especially in the paranormal world for his,
The
for all
show.
his
Oh,
interviews and stuff.
Oh yeah, and not to mention, I was on with George Norrie in June. It was a lot of fun, and I got to talk about our investigation. So for me to
Mhm.
go and sit down and talk to George was absolutely fabulous. Nicest guy in the world, and really down to earth. And one thing I love about George, at least I can say about him, is he doesn't never misses a show. He took over for Art in '03 and still is there every night, night in and night out. And
Yeah.
that's a commendable effort, for him to continue exactly what he had started. And of course, George has always been there from day one, and he's done a commendable job. And of course, I know Whitley Strieber and Art Bell were really good friends too. Whitley, of course,
Yes. Yes.
wrote the books Communion and Hunger and
Communion.
Wolf and Yep. And of course, Whitley and Art were like best friends as well. And I think they were only like pretty born a month apart. And and what's
Yeah.
pretty cool is Art's old announcer did some voiceovers for us in like 2022. Like the
Mhm.
I'll send that to you. So if you want to use that
Yes, yes.
for intro,
Let me tell you
and
something,
you can
some of
just
my favorite interviews are the ones he did with Malachi Martin, Father Martin.
oh yeah,
Man, those
definitely.
are the
And
best, man. Those things were great. This was like
and
pre-Y2K, world's coming
yes,
to an end, kind of deal.
absolutely. And those are pretty amazing because I think if I remember, Malachi Martin was like a Jesuit priest. He actually
Yes, yes.
like was he actually had all kinds of crazy stuff like from like he's had like hundreds and hundreds of demonic cases, and he went
Oh,
over like
yes. And I've read
so
I have
many.
read his books, and let me tell you something. You read his books, which were based on real stories, yet, they changed the names. Let me tell you something, his descriptors, you read some of that, and it's like, holy crap. It was like very, it did a number in your head because he gave a lot of details that you don't normally hear. But yeah,
Absolutely.
his interviews were fascinating.
They really were, and I always enjoyed them. And I'm so glad because those old shows are always going to be out there. Like from the '90s and 2000s, like you could still find like a bunch of his old shows, like
Yeah,
just by like
yeah.
googling like
Yeah,
Art
that one,
Bell Mad.
Hostage to the Devil is the title on that one. But he wrote a bunch of, fictional, like, thriller type stories. He was a very good writer. He was a very good writer.
Absolutely,
But
I think he died sometime in the late '90s, according to my
late
research.
90s,
Sometime,
late 90s, yes.
yeah,
That's why I think that, that's one of the reasons why they were talking about that Art Bell's interviews with him was, like, right those few years right before he died, and this was
yeah,
also when they were discussing The Secret of Fatima, and of course, like I tell everybody, people that are not Y2K back then, before Y2K came and went and nothing happened, it was like the end of the world, economies were gonna collapse,
Yeah, it's supposed to
computers
the
couldn't
stock market
handle
was
it,
supposed yeah.
you name it, you name it.
There
You know,
there
they
was
built up they did a bunch of movies in Hollywood about,
yeah.
everything,
It
a meteor hitting us, what else? It was yeah. So, yeah,
pretty wild
it was
stuff. And according to supposedly they're supposed to be like computers were supposed to crash, the stock market was supposed to crash. I mean,
yeah,
all this
everything was supposed to, like, economic meltdown, and then nothing happened.
absolutely,
But, yeah,
absolutely.
when you listen to a lot of their and obviously, they had no knowledge, of course, what was gonna happen in 9/11. But back then, the big thing was the year 2000 was going to be the big
Everything was supposed to go under. Right.
yeah, and nothing happened. It's like, yeah, that was it? You mean that was it? But,
It was more just like it was more just like a superstition. Like, people just like
yes.
say, oh, like, just like for example, like Jesus Christ is supposed to return to Earth on this day.
Oh, no, it was like I know that there was a couple of doomsday cults out there saying the same thing, like these people, the Haley Bob people,
Yeah,
the UFO is gonna come riding and let's go, and by the way, let's kill ourselves while we're at it. But yeah, you had a lot of, what they call those death cults,
yeah,
around as a matter of fact, not even the United States and Europe, where they were prepping some type of like, let's all die and because the
yeah,
world's ending kind of deal. Crazy. It sounds
absolutely.
crazy, but yeah, you'd be surprised what people will believe. But yeah, the thing with Art Bell and yeah, sometimes I wish it's like, man, Art, why did you die? Because he was really and like I'm sure everybody, his format of just unscreened phone calls. Some of them I listened to him just to laugh at some of the
Right.
calls he would get.
Yeah,
You know,
like for example, one of my favorite ones that he did supposedly this was somewhere around 97, 98. According there was supposedly that there was this caller that called in one night on open line saying that they were above Area 51 or something. And then of
yes.
course months later it turned out to be just a fabricated call, but that's what Art did. He gave everyone a theater of the
Oh
mind.
yeah.
Him
Oh, that
like
guy Mel's Hole. I think it's
yes.
at Washington, Mel's Hole.
Yep.
Some of that
Yep.
stuff I mean, some people you would listen to and you go, boy, that person's crazy. And other people, they sounded very sane. And they were just
Right.
saying, wait, time travelers. And it was like,
Right.
it was great. And some of them, by the way, had excellent, excellent ghost stories.
Oh,
People
they
talking
really
about
did. Like they
they
would
were
call in
great.
like from all over the world, like from
Hmm.
Hawaii to Canada to England to Italy. I mean, he had a worldwide audience,
Yes.
and I think
Yes.
at his peak, somewhere in the '90s, he was on like 500 radio stations that had like 15 to 20 million listeners, something like a
Yes.
million a
Yes.
night on about the
Yes.
same time. And I think Art and Ramona really created Coast to Coast a love for their listeners, a love for radio, and a love just for
Oh
blowing
yeah,
people out of the
people. There
water.
was a lot of night owls, people out there, and and west of the Rockies, east of the Rockies, you whatever. When you hear his
Absolutely,
really
and
early stuff.
absolutely, and Ross Mitchell, of course, really kind of created that like that element for his announcer. Really kind of brought that like element to his
Hmm.
shows.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, that unexpected, you never knew what you were going to get because he wasn't screening his calls. It was just him, and he was like, "All right." And every once in a while, I know he had to cut off people if they were like, they used like language, inappropriate language. But
Right.
most
Oh
of the
yeah,
time, he let people run with it. It's like, okay, all right.
yes he did. And one of his favorite rules was no bad language, one call per show.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, and he had his people, he had the people that were like "Hey, so and so, oh, so and so," yeah, somebody that would call that they
Yeah.
became known. But yeah, that format, I think that, that was really interesting. That did a lot as far as the paranormal, as
Oh
far
yeah.
as
Like
and then
to me,
everybody out there had
to
their
me, like
their moments.
who really he was kind of the first to talk about things like UFOs and with
Yes,
John Lear and then Linda Moulton Howe doing her reports
yes,
from Dreamland back in the '90s with Art. He was pretty much the first host to really pioneer paranormal radio. Like there was nobody like unlike him because he was
right.
just so bored doing like political talk radio.
Yeah,
His
yeah,
early version of Coast to Coast AM he used to be called West Coast AM. He found it in the late '70s or late '80s, and then he got kind of bored of that. And sometime in the early '90s, he started really. I think that's where his listener base exploded because he started doing like the paranormal, and I think that's when his numbers just went way up because.
yeah.
And not to
People
mention,
wanted to
I
hear these stories, these wacky stories, whether you
yep,
believed it or not. And then there was other people that they would say, you could tell these were
yeah,
normal, everyday people. They had this one incident, and they would say, this happened to me, and I could never explain. You could tell the way we were talking, this was a sane person that could just
Right.
never explain what that paranormal event was.
Exactly.
And
And what was wild was like he just had a way of being able to let people tell their stories, and it was so revolutionary. And I believe he actually has the Guinness Book of World Record holder for endurance broadcasting. I think one night is what his son Vincent told me. He said, because of course Vincent was his son back in the '60s, but
uh-huh.
he had told me that somehow like one night in Okinawa that supposedly he went like I think 50, like you like literally 120 consecutive hours, like just broadcasting nonstop. He's in the Guinness Book of World Record holder for endurance broadcasting, like for being able to do it
Wow,
all,
that's a long time.
something like that. Yeah, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 plus hours. So that's pretty wild for him to be able to
No,
get
no, he
that.
was and he was like and, no, I would just the stories, like I said, the format was that's the spontaneity, how's that? The
Yes,
spontaneity, and I'm gonna throw this in at the I know that I think that compared to a lot of the paranormal shows that sometimes have become a little bit too formulaic,
right,
I wanna say that this was a little bit better. The closest that's come is, some of the shows where they'll interview the original people and then they'll have actors do the storyline. You know what I'm saying?
yes, yep.
But they're
Like, oh,
interviewing the original, and I think there's something about when you see everyday people, talking about their
right,
experiences that's very
yeah.
captivating. That's I think that was one of the most interesting things that Art Bell had about his format.
It,
Um, and then he just like I
oh,
said, he let them run. He just like whatever they were gonna say.
and one thing I love too is not only that, but also he just did one guest a show. He didn't like see
Yes,
when Keith when Dave Schrader and different hosts took over Midnight the Desert, they would have like 3 or 4 guests in a show. But Art's formula was just one guest for four or
yes,
five hours, and they would just see. I think that was Art's way of letting drawing out their stories, being able to get more and more information out of them,
right.
and try to let them kind of tell their story in a way that would
Yeah,
present it
they
to the
would go
listening
to
audience.
they would discuss things that yeah, the conversation would evolve into these areas where all of a sudden they were talking about, firsthand experiences, stuff maybe that wasn't included in that book that they wrote, which is really
Yeah,
what people wanna that behind the scenes look,
yep.
um, or their own personal experiences. Yeah, of course, that's very interesting, and let's face it, if you were an investigator, an author, or whatever, you wanted to be on Art Bell's show because if you were interviewed by Art Bell, your name is gonna be known,
Oh, absolutely, and not
you
to
know?
mention, like once you get on, like getting on that radio show, it's like syndicating like 600 plus stations all over the
Yes.
world. You're going to be known by like you're going to get all kinds of offers from like listeners that might have like an opportunity for a location for you to investigate, or a place where or a UFO case, or they might need you to come on like in for some magazine or publication. So getting on like coast to coast is a huge honor for every person, because
Yes.
even today with George Norrie, it still like continues the tradition. So getting on there is like it brings you clout and notoriety.
Oh, yes. If you're saying, "Yeah, I was on Coast to Coast," absolutely. It does. It does because that's but, the origins was, what Art Bell did and what's really funny is and I think is, like, nobody thought that so many people would listen to the radio during the wee hours.
Right.
Usually you think of that time as dead time, no pun
Right, like
intended.
people would be asleep, but that's when like I think a lot of
Yes.
it, because not to mention different time zones all over the world. So for some different time zones, it would like a 1 o'clock a.m. or 9 o'clock
Yes.
p.m. West Coast time might be like 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock a.m. in different parts of the world. So he by
Yes.
having all these different time zones covered, he would be able to go into like listeners from all over, from Japan to China to Guam to the
Yes.
Philippines. So he would be able to cover all over the world. And so what happened was he sold a KNY station to Karen Jackson, his neighbor, sometime around 2010. And so he moved off. He actually founded Radio in Pahrump, basically. And
Yeah.
even if you drive by his property today, his property's on Desert Lane in Pahrump. You can still see the radio towers like all over the property.
Right, you're right, and, like, he was in the literally in the middle of nowhere when he started. It was
Yeah.
like, that's way out there in the middle of nowhere,
Yeah, and not to
you
mention, he
know?
was a certified radio operator when he was
Yeah,
13. Vincent told me that his boy told me, I think sometime around 13 or 14, he got his ham license. So it's pretty amazing he was able to, roll with that.
yeah, yeah, that's one of those things, what is it, your first love kinda deal?
Yeah.
And he kept on it, and there you go. and the rest is
Exactly.
history.
Yes, it
But
is.
yeah,
And
he was absolutely, like I said, I still enjoy listening to him, you know, because
oh
they've
yeah,
released some of his shows from the vault,
yeah. Like
so I really enjoy that stuff,
me
and some
too.
of his earlier stuff, and you know, people like, and this was I remember when well, obviously when he first got his website up, that he would post pictures and he would tell people, "Go over there, look
Yeah,
at this picture,"
right.
and things
And
like,
what's
and of
really
course,
cool
my
is
absolute best are Ghost to Ghost, Halloween. That's the
oh
best.
yeah. One thing I
That's
loved
the
about
best.
what he did with Ghost to Ghost was he gave people a platform to send over ghost stories live. And what he did was he would actually, of course, he did a second version on Dark Matter. He called it I can't remember if it was called Dead. Oh, I don't remember what the name of it is. But what he did was he actually read live ghost stories over the radio, and then like he would have
Yes,
people submit listeners submit. Oh, Dead Air. It was his second version of Ghost to Ghost
right.
was called Dead Air on Dark Matter. So what he did, he let people, and of course Heather did her version called The Hauntings of Nye. So
Yes.
basically, he would have submit ghost stories live over the air, and he would read them. And what's great is Nori today still continues the ghost to ghost tradition. So reading the ghost stories were always a lot of fun. Where saying people would submit them
Yes.
from different, like saying, "Hey, I saw a ghost. I was walking up the stairs one night. I started catching this presence." So he'd read all those stuff over the air. It was really neat.
Let me tell you something. I'm gonna interject real quick. There was one story I've never forgotten. God knows. There's one story, and this guy, he's telling him how this guy's an engineer for, I want to either say Caterpillar or this is an engineer, and
Right,
he says how he moves out to this town, Wisconsin, you somewhere up in the Midwest. So he gets this,
right,
buys his house, moves. He's moving in, and he says that he puts a dresser in what was supposed to be his daughter's bedroom. And they're
right.
coming in and out, unloading. And he says all of a sudden he goes back in there, puts something else, and he can't open the door. So he's
Wow.
thinking his son is pulling a trick on him because
Right,
he's like, why can't I open this door? The
right,
chest of drawers he had just put on there was up
right.
against the door.
Wow, that's amazing.
And
That
all of a
really
sudden he says his son, it sounded like a teenage son, comes in through the door and he's looking at him
yeah.
like, okay, that wasn't you. And this guy says, like, he could, in other words, he says he couldn't figure out how that chest of drawers in an empty
That's just it.
room
Right,
had
it's an empty room.
moved up against the door and he couldn't open it.
So
Finally, he
so
shoved it open
and he's
and he says he tells his wife, and his wife told him, "Okay, but that's not gonna be the daughter's room, forget it." And he says he made it into a poker room.
right,
So he says a
right,
story that a few years later eventually moves out because he's one of these guys, I guess, that moves around depending where the company puts him. So he says
yeah,
like
so he
5 or
kind
6 years later, he's coming by and he sees the house is up for sale. So he's like,
right,
he just stops out of curiosity. Well, or maybe a little bit more. Maybe I don't know if 6, 7, 8 was a few years afterwards. Starts
right,
it's got an open house. Real
right,
estate agent is,
yep,
and she's kind of telling him, please don't tell me that. He comes to find out this house had changed hands like maybe every 12 to 18 months.
wow. So pretty much
So that
like it had a revolving door owners, like one person would have it for a year and
right.
a
And it
half,
was
and
like
all
a
of a sudden
modern, when I say a modern house, it was like a regular, residential neighborhood. Like
right,
it wasn't an older home or anything. And I love that story because you really don't have any explanation as to how, why, or anything. But
right.
that obviously something was going on there. Yeah, it kept losing owners frequently.
Oh yeah, definitely. And what was wild was like if there goes, it kind of reminds you of like a lot like Amityville and basically Summerwind. People would have it for a couple of limited time, then give it back to the
Yes.
owner, then it would cycle through owners and just have the same experiences over and over, unless they start cleansing these houses and like doing
Yeah.
sage and different things like that. It's these houses are going to continue with that ever revolving door.
Even though you know what, that the Amityville, from what I understand, the family has
Right,
said that nothing after the Phil murders and the Lutzes and that whole debacle,
right, yeah.
unless they kept it very quiet, I've heard that they've lived there, that they haven't had any. I mean, I know they changed the numerical address of the house. You know,
They used to call like Ocean Avenue or something like that for a
yeah, but
time.
no,
Then
it's
it
still
just
on Ocean Avenue, but they changed the numbers portion of the house to something else.
oh, so that way
Whatever.
kind of cheap. Maybe it
And
protects
they've
like
said, "No, we've never had any of the experiences that the Lutzes."
right.
And as a matter of fact, Art Bell frequently brought on George Lutz on
Yeah,
the
I believe he
show,
did. I believe
and
he
he
did.
that was
And
really interesting, interviews with George Lutz, as far as that he would talk about what his experiences were. It was really,
yeah,
but he had him on there a few times. They're really interesting. As a matter of fact, when you listen to those interviews with Art Bell and
Yeah,
George Lutz, they offered a lot
yeah,
more, how can I say, about that Amityville. Like, you know, there's always been the thing whether they were basically faked it or not.
yeah,
But when you
and,
listen
and
to George Lutz, he didn't
pretty
he
credible.
sounded like pretty honest about it, but then you never know.
Right. And I think didn't Lorraine Warren and the Warrens actually did actually like 'cause I know the Warrens, I knew the Warren son-in-law Tony Sparrow, and I know John
Mhm.
Zaffis, of course, who he was Ed Lorraine's nephew. I believe didn't the Warrens investigate the Amityville? I think
Yes,
back
they
in the
did.
late
They did.
seventies,
Yes, they
sometime
did.
back
And as
then.
a matter of fact, around the time that they were doing it. That's when they caught that photograph of that little kid,
Yeah.
up the
I,
stairs, that they say that the child looked like one of the failed children boys that got killed.
yeah, the
And
DeFeo boys, I think.
right, that I think it was a reporter. It was one of those deals that a bunch of people had gone there and they caught it supposedly when there
Yep.
was nobody in the house, like no children.
Yeah.
How's that? Like, what's this
Yes.
little kid gonna be doing peeking? And that Ellen Lorraine War, yeah, that's another one that. And then off it went. And again, you never know. Were the new owners saying we can't talk about this because if we ever try to sell this house, we're never going to be able to?
Right.
Or was
And
it
I
really
think
nothing happened?
a lot of the stories I believe were made up to give it like more press and kind of kind of like a way to get more revenue for the place and to try to
Hmm.
pretty much like I believe some of the stories, yes, but I also believe a lot of these people having a lot of it was made for like tourism, like just much
Sure,
like the
absolutely.
to get more money, to get more people there, and to try to get like some more visitors and different stuff like that. So a lot of tourism and stuff like that. So I think a lot of the stories from Amityville, the hauntings,
Yeah,
and
Butch
sometimes
Butch
those.
DeFeo died. I think it was at 2021 or 2022. He
Yeah, I
died.
think so.
Hmm.
Ronald DeFeo actually murdered his whole family. That's I think according to the history of the
Well, no,
place.
yeah,
Sometimes,
and this is the thing. That house obviously had history, and it makes you think. Is I mean, this unfortunately that guy he was doing a lot of drugs. Butch DeFeo
yeah,
was doing a lot of like it's like really like
yeah,
you know was was it only strangely drugs? Obviously, it was they had dysfunction in the house, or was there something else in that house already that pushed them over the edge? And because there was a lot of versions of that he eventually talked about as to why or how he did it, and God knows that's a whole different thing. But yeah, the as far as the Lutzes, I don't know. I've heard conflicting stories as to that. No, that they didn't buy the house with the intention of s- you know
right.
having what Jay Ansem write that book and become like a runaway bestseller, whatever. You
Oh
know.
yeah, definitely. I think a lot of tourism and, like you said, the ghost stories to try to get an extra bang for the buck. They could say.
Well, I mean, you've even heard that it was like, was a mafia involved? I mean, yeah, I've heard of all the different like what ifs. The only thing I'll tell you what, the only thing, and you tell me what you think, Joshua. The only thing I can never figure out is they had 5 people shot in there, and no
Yes.
neighbors heard the shots.
No neighbor.
How does?
Yes, and that's pretty. There, my opinion, like what happened was they must, unless he did it like so stealthily and so quiet, like he basically, you would think that a neighbor like would hear it, like basically live like pretty much like within 30 feet or 50 feet away would be able to
Yeah,
hear those shots. But for basically no neighbors to hear that, he must have
this
like
is
he
the
had
middle of the
soundproof.
night. He killed them in the middle of the night when it's a
Yeah,
residential area where it's really quiet. You would think, really, especially in the middle of the night. And let's say you
and
hear one shot, and you could be like, "Was that a shot?" But then
exactly.
at the
You would think it would alert like all the neighbors nearby and alert everyone in the
yes,
town. Like it would be like a chain reaction, like a domino effect. All these lights
yes,
coming on, and like all of a sudden, like, what the hell's going over there?
or
You would think
somebody
you'd
at
see
least
police
coming
sirens.
out and saying, "Hey, I heard." You would think something's happening. Something's, and that's the part of everything that I've never quite understood. How somebody could get shot 5 shots go off in the middle of the night
Right,
in a residential neighborhood. By the way, this is not high crime where everybody's like, "Hey, mind your own business." This is a little
right,
nice residential neighborhood. Nobody calls the police. Nobody comes out and says, "Hey, like what's going on?" That's the only
right.
part I don't get.
Like
You
I
know.
never understood that, and I think a lot of it, like you would think that there would be like more and more, like you would think that the cops would have been there, like to get this guy, apprehend this guy. You would have think that there would have been like more and more like people aware, like so maybe somehow neighbors going into like maybe help the family out, maybe like to apprehend this guy and try to take him down because there could have been a break in. I mean, who knows,
Yeah.
what people were thinking. you would think that there would have been someone there, like a neighbor, that maybe, like, try to go in there and help the family, or like fire marshals or police or
Yeah.
something, some kind of do something to help the people there.
Right, right. I guess my question is, I'm not gonna say that the neighbors are gonna assume that the family is being killed.
Right,
They're thinking something's
right.
going on, is somebody being held up? Is somebody something,
Like,
where people
right.
come
So it's a
outside just to
break in.
check out, like,
Is it like a
yeah,
home invasion, or is it
home
like something going?
invasion, what's going on, I
Right,
don't know. That to me is really weird. And but yeah, that of all the mysteries there, that's the which is, by the way, that did happen. It's not like the rest of the story, which is, there's different versions of what happened. But yeah,
right,
anomalies like that around, um, we could put the paranormal slant on that. I have run across other cases of what they call family annihilators, okay,
right,
where gunshots involved, and for some reason nobody hears gunfire as in
right.
neighbors.
Yep.
And
And like,
you're asking yourself, okay, is there obviously the guy's doing his thing, but is there something else going on as far as in that moment of pure evil where
right,
you're getting people killed that
right.
so yeah, I've read other cases and I've done other research on other cases like that where for some reason nobody, same
Like
thing,
for
residential neighborhoods
and think
and
about, like,
gunfire. Well, one
especially for me,
guy
like
in
I love.
Ohio, he was the one that 4 p.m. that called the cops and said nobody had responded. He had killed everybody.
Right.
He had killed his mother,
Oh,
his brother's wife, and their 5 kids on Easter
right,
inside the home. Nobody responds. He's the one around 4 or 5 p.m. because the family had gathered for like an Easter thing in Ohio.
right,
Calls up and goes, he calls up. He's the one that calls the
right,
police and says, I just finished doing this.
right,
Okay. And this is a house in a residential neighborhood. I can't remember the exact town in Ohio. This happened like, I
yeah,
want to say 77, something like that. Same thing. Nobody heard gunshot. So yes, there's
right.
it's really weird when you do that investigation as far as
Oh
you
yeah,
know,
definitely. And
what is it,
and
the
I
the
think
co- the
especially.
dome of silence or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's pretty wild for that to happen. So you would think that overall, for that to happen, it was pretty crazy, and you just don't know, like, especially it's going on in these houses, like what in that moment, basically, when that strike of fear going through going through you.
Oh, absolutely. Let me ask you something. Are you working on
Sure,
any book, on any project besides what you said or anything? As far as for my podcast listeners, what is the website that they can go to? Is it Phantom
sure.
Detectives?
Sure. So what I'll do is I'll give you all of our websites, and you can
Yes,
just
go ahead.
plug those in. And sure. So the
Absolutely.
first website I would like to plug in is Mark Anthony, the psychic lawyer, psychic explorer.
Yes, yes.
You can find him at afterlifefrequency.com. So it's all one word,
Okay.
afterlifefrequency.com. That's Mark's website. You can reach him directly.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a UFO case you want investigated, you want
Yes.
something done on the UFO end. If we want Rick to look into a case, his website is the ERC, so it's the number ERC, so that's
O-
ERC2explorer.com. That's ERC2explorer.com. So that's
Okay.
Rick's website for his own UFO research. He runs the Extraterrestrial Research Center, so ERC2explorer.com. To
Okay.
reach Melissa, I didn't get a chance to talk to Melissa, our psychic medium, but Melissa's website is
Mm-hmm.
all one word, psychicmediumautumn.com. So if you need a
Okay.
reading done, or you want, she's a protege, a student of Cindy Kaiser from the Holzer files. She studied mediumship and advanced development. Her website, psychicmediumautumn.com. She also serves as our case manager for Phantom Detectives. To reach myself and my websites, which are the team website, you want to reach the team, and that is
Mm-hmm.
all one word, phantomdetectives.org. For the team website, phantomdetectives.org. And to
Okay.
reach, also, if you want to reach me on Dark Matter News, all one word, darkmatternews.com.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, because I'll put a link in the credits of the show, but for the podcast listeners, sometimes they can't write stuff down, so that's why I ask my guests to just give out their website addresses. And on there, what you post any of the events that you're doing or any of the things
Yeah.
that you're working on.
Yep, yep, yep. You can also reach us on all the social media sites, where we also have Phantom Detectives and Dark Matter News on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Flickr, Tumblr, YouTube, Google. I mean, on YouTube, we're basically always like uploading. Like we'll do paranormal equipment reviews. We
Okay.
also have and we also have a really cool thing we're offering your listeners if they're interested. We
Yes.
actually back in earlier this year we recorded a bunch of instructional videos how to teach people on. We have a subscription system that is now available. If you go to phantomdetectives.org, we have a Patreon page where you can see all of our investigation videos, all of the
Okay.
interviews that we've done throughout our history with the locations that we've been. You can
Okay.
also all the dark matter news audio files or everything is
Hmm.
on this Patreon page. That's patreon.com/phantom detectives. Patreon.com/phantom detectives. And we actually have
Okay.
your listeners. We can offer a subscriber where they can pay like 20 or $5, $10 a month and get like all of our videos and more, and all of
All
our
your
best free
archives
one.
and everything.
Yep, yep,
That's great. That's fantastic. And this is what? This is video archives, right?
yep. All of our instructional videos, all of our
Hmm.
investigations, all of that stuff is on that Patreon.
Oh man. Okay. Well, it's that. Well, it says 2024 is going to be very busy for you.
Oh, definitely. We're looking forward to building this thing and getting it bigger because I can already see we're already starting to build a large following. We've been in magazines now. We've been on local television. We've
Hmm.
already have been on numerous radio shows all over the world, like Coast to Coast, Talk is Jericho with
Yes.
Chris Jericho. So I
Yes.
think this thing's only going to get bigger as time goes on. The more that
Sure.
we keep practicing, the more that we keep working, I expect it to get even more and more traction. So I think because now we're looking to start talking about, we've already been in Delaware, we've already investigated in Pennsylvania. Now we're talking
Yes.
about expanding possibly into New Jersey and Maryland. So I think it's all going to get bigger as time goes on. So just the more you keep at it, the bigger it
Absolutely.
gets.
That's the good thing is that you guys, where you're up there in the Northeast, you can go to all these states because you're all very close. It's all very close to each other,
Right.
travel
It's a
wise.
It's a great feeling because you just hop right down the road. You're in Delaware. Hop right down the
Yes.
road. You're in New Jersey. Hop right down the road. You're in Maryland.
This
It's a
is the
great. It's a
oldest parts of the
tri-state.
country. This is the stuff that's, revolutionary times. You've got a lot of stuff there that's really, really old, dating back to the 16 and 1700s. So
Oh
absolutely,
yeah,
yeah, you got
Ab-
plenty of places to go to.
absolutely. And there's always never ending client. And also, I want to give one more website out that
Sure.
people a really neat directory. So in 2020, there was this guy named Bill Wilk. Bill actually, of course, created a website called paranormalsocieties.com.
I'm
It
on
was a directory where,
paranormalsocieties.com for many
yep.
years. Yes.
Yeah. So basically, unfortunately, what happened was so Bill created this website around 2007, and so
Hmm.
basically in June 2020, his last post was that he was looking for help. Unfortunately, paranormalsocieties.com is now abandoned and no more. So what I did was I connected with one of Bill's friends named Josh Vandywetter, and Josh
Hmm.
decided he built a new version of the website because since there's so many teams that we're trying to ask to be put into the directory, so the website was like a 4,892 teams that he left it at, with like
Yes.
hundreds, dozens more of teams to be approved for the directory. So Josh went
Hmm.
ahead and programmed a new website. He bought the domain. So the new website is paranormalsocieties.org. To just switch out the .com with the .org. And what Josh did was not only did he expand the original Bill
Okay.
Wilk directory, but he made it better. He actually added in like locations where teams can submit locations. Because Bill was working on another website before he vanished called paranormalhotspots.com, paranormal
Okay.
hotspots. So Josh went
So
ahead
let me
and
ask you what paranormalsocieties.com that got abandoned. It's just static. In other words, they haven't deleted, they haven't added. It's just whatever's there is there. That's a shame.
yeah, it's just an abandoned ghost town now. So the new website is paranormalsocieties.org. So that's the one
Okay.
where if teams. So basically, if you register, you can also register your team. You can
Yeah,
set
I'm
up your
looking at it
service
right now.
areas. Yep. What you specialize on. So everything is on the new website. You can see the directory.
Yes.
Josh has done a great job of continuing Bill's legacy, but it's also doing it. Even he's expanding upon it and adding more features.
Yeah, that's great. Let me tell you something. Paranormal Societies, believe it or not, originally for many years, like you said in '07, he was one of the first to come up with like a directory type of listing for groups, you know,
Oh
especially
yeah.
if you wanted to find somebody that was local in your area. And the reason
Right.
why I say that is I would always have people calling me all the time, either looking for services or to join a group. And it was like, oh
Right.
man, I don't know. Uh,
Oh yeah.
so
It,
yeah, that's
it was a
great.
great. So at
Yes, it
least like
was.
I'm glad to see that at least Bill, like, I don't know what happened to Bill. I think Bill passed away. I can't prove that. But I think that
Nobody's been
if
able
that's
to
one
reach
thing.
him, huh?
nobody's been able to reach him. So I think what happened was he either like was stressed out and just walked away from it, or he passed away. My assumption is I think he probably passed away
Mhm,
because. But the thing is that when Josh went to try to locate Bill and try
mhm.
to figure out like whatever happened to him, like he had noticed that the paranormalsocieties.com domain, there's a credit card that's been renewed every year. So
Yeah,
somebody is renewing the website. It could be a family member, it could be just a card that he had, like, that had like 6 or 7 years
yeah,
on it, the expiration date wise. But somehow the every time Josh tries to make a claim for paranormalsocieties.com, it renews. So there's something going on there. Either he walked away or he just pretty much just he passed away, and no one's ever like found an obituary for him. So no one knows, but at least Josh is there to continue the legacy, and
yes,
I think he's done a fabulous job with the new website. So, all your listeners that have teams,
sure,
paranormalsocieties.org is a great way to do it. It's a great way to submit your information to the new directory.
absolutely. Again, it has been great to speak to you, Joshua, and I wanna wish you the best of luck on everything, and
Yes,
I'll
thank
I'll
you.
I'll keep tabs on you so you can come back and we can talk about what you're doing, because, yeah, you've got your finger in a lot of,
Different
and
buckets.
yes, absolutely, and,
Thank
I
you.
hope you do something with the dark matter, I really do,
I hope so
Art
too.
Bell's legacy, yeah.
Absolutely, and I hope someday I can eventually acquire the company. I'm not really too concerned because I got my own platform that's going to take off and get bigger over time. So if I get it,
Mhm.
great. If not, at least I got the dark matter news, and I'll just run with it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I
Awesome.
know what that's about.
Yes.
Good luck to you.
Thank you. You have a
Take
nice day.
You too, bye-bye, take care. Alright, there you go. We talked about Art Bell, see? Yeah, you can tell I'm an Art Bell fan. And sometimes, listening to his how people progress, like, like I said, pre-Y2K, when he had a newsletter and people had to call the 800 numbers, or if you're east of the Rockies, if you're west of the Rockies, if you're this, if you're that, first time callers. And then as then he had the website and, things like that. But yeah, and his format I think is fabulous because, and let me tell you something, he was very gutsy to take callers without screening them. Let me tell you, that could go wrong in a lot of ways. But overall, I think it was a really good format because I think people really like to hear stories from other ordinary people about things that had happened to them. Yeah, and you could tell the story. Sometimes it was like this was a one-time thing that happened to them. This wasn't like, oh yeah, I was continuously. Yeah, you did have people that sounded like they were haunted, but overall, you also had a lot of people. When I'm talking about like the ghost to ghost and stuff like that, where people were talking about, man, I had this one situation that happened, and they would describe it, and then they just never got an explanation of why, or they had lived as a kid at this house and then they moved away. And some of them eventually researched and said, I found this out, this happened in that house while we were living there. I love those stories. And then, of course, when he started interviewing people coast to coast and everything, like Joshua was saying, if you were with, interviewed by Art Bell on Coast to Coast, that was it. You had lots of people listening to you, lots of people. And of course, whether it was ghosts or UFOs or time travel or, you know, everybody's out there like, remember, these are also, um, the X Files is a 90s thing. Everybody loved the X Files because, whether you believe it or not, or you think it's good entertainment, I consider it food for thought. So anyway, guys, I've got a bunch of great guests already, like I said, lined up for season 15 of Stories of the Supernatural. In 2024, I've got a great, great guests coming on. Like I said, go to miamigoschronicles.com, mpellicer.com, erie.news. You're going to find links to my Substack newsletter there. I've also got links there if you want to listen to any of the podcast versions of any of the shows without commercial interruption. You can find them on my website, and you can find me on all the major podcast platforms. You're going to find me there. Whatever it is, you're going to find me there. One of the best ones, though, to find me at is Spreaker. But again, you can find me on whether, and I even have links If you don't have one, whether you, let's say if you have an Android or an iOS system or an Apple kind of, I've got links there that will take you over so you can look at the different apps that are available that'll work with your phone and that, that you could listen to the show on. But like I said, if you go to my website, you can listen to it without commercial interruption. So again, guys, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. You'll be hearing from me again. But whether I know the show's a little bit staggered, but either way, I want to thank you for coming back every week and hanging out and listening to all these interesting people that we bring on. Till next time, take care.